Morning found the mountain town beneath a gloomy sky, its peaks hidden many yards up the slopes. An old man, returning from pasture, was the first to spot the small body by the cracked fence. His expression shifted as he leaned over the boy's motionless figure. The child's chest had been torn open by a clean, brutal slash. A cold wind slipped through the thin fabric of his shirt, and from the yard came the smell of damp boards and unease. Within minutes, people gathered near the fence. They stood several yards away, staring tensely at the horrific sight. The town elder, Rudrick Van, ordered everyone not to interfere, pushing onlookers back and trying to find any tracks. The hunters spoke among themselves, but none dared to touch the body. They only shook their heads at the sight of the boy's ripped ribs. Neither a brown bear nor a wolf would have left such precise cuts. A suffocating silence hung over it all, broken only by the sound of footsteps and hushed whispers. Soon, a priest named Talric Greywolf appeared from the alley, his tattered robe trembling in the gusts. He knelt by the body, running his palm over the boy's slashed chest, tension etched on his face. He quietly said this was no ordinary animal attack. Some listened with superstitious dread. Before the townspeople could decide how to react, Maria Borg, the boy's mother, hurled herself at the body, choking on her grief. She dropped to her knees, trying to clutch her son's cold fingers. Her sobs filled the air, making many avert their eyes. Elder Van, taking off his cap, called over Perrin, a young guard. He hurried up awkwardly, attempting to pull Maria away. Everyone knew her fiery temper. No one wanted her to seize a knife in uncontrollable despair. Straightening, the priest's gaze warned of something dangerous nearby. He said the monster was not hiding far off, but right at the forest's edge. No one argued. The hunters only exchanged furtive glances. Van swallowed his own fear and announced he would gather people. He ordered 2 hunters to remain with the body while the priest examined the surrounding tracks. Several residents were already running to the forge for torches. Between sobs, Maria Borg whispered that her husband, Ollie, had not returned from a neighboring town. He had left days before, leaving her alone. Her son lay dead on the cold ground. Perrin stood by, not knowing how to help. Everyone could sense that something terrible had happened, and it might happen again. A tall man with a rapier appeared at the gates. He asked the elder if they would reinforce the guard. Rudrick replied that some volunteers would go into the forest while the others armed themselves. Then Talric suggested they make the town appear unprotected. In his view, the creature would emerge once it believed most of the townspeople were gone. The child's corpse filled everyone with dread. Whispers spread that no such killing had ever occurred in all the years these mountains had been inhabited. The elder couldn't bring himself to look at the boy's bloodied chest for long. He said he would speak with the families and gather the best trackers. The hunters planned to leave under the guidance of Thorne Keller, known for his skill in pursuing beasts. Van hoped this would keep the others safe. The priest continued examining the bloodstains. He stepped toward the fence, touched a broken board, and listened to the empty yard. Then he quietly warned the elder that the creature might appear again as soon as that night. His words weighed on those who heard them. When they lifted the boy's body, Maria sank to her knees beside it. Her soft moans were swept away by the wind. Perrin helped her stand and led her home. Van asked a few women to look after her until Ollie returned. At the forge, tools clanged. 2 men were readying rifles, checking their ammunition. 3 more were reinforcing the gates with thick boards. By midday, most of the townspeople had locked themselves indoors, hiding their children. No one wanted to roam the streets where bloodstains still marked the ground. Van tried to show resolve, but was trembling as though with fever. Soon the priest gathered several hunters. He said they could lure the monster into town while the main group followed Thorne Keller up into the mountains. The rest would stay ready. Some murmured that the plan was too risky, but Talric insisted the creature would not slip away. So it was decided. Create a trap while the townspeople hid behind their walls in fear. The elder gave a weak nod, knowing there was no other choice. The air was thick with the scent of blood and despair. The boy's body was placed beneath a lean-to by the barn. Maria shut herself inside her home, unable to speak to anyone. The townspeople stared blankly at her door, where muffled sobs could still be heard. All they could do was await the hunt's outcome, hoping the beast would be caught in a snare instead of coming for them the following night. Fog stretched through the alleys like a damp sack draped over the wet cobblestones. In one house, Maria Borg sat on a low stool, elbows on her knees. Her hand shook, her gaze empty, as though only one image smoldered in her mind. That dreadful moment when she saw her boy lying on the cold earth. Her husband, Ollie Borg, was gone, and there was no one to soothe her sobs. Neighbors heard her moaning at night, but no one dared enter without reason. Eventually, Priest Talric Greywolf came to her himself, carrying a clay cup of herbal brew. He offered it, asked her to drink, and promised it would at least momentarily quell her crushing pain. She took a few sips, and her pale lips stopped trembling. Outside, Perrin the guard stood waiting for any sign that she might try to leave the house, driven by grief. Meanwhile, in the town square, Elder Rudrick Van had gathered several heads of families to discuss how many people to send on the upcoming foray. He eyed the low fences and the sooty chimneys of the homes where families were hiding. People feared stepping outside. The memories of that horrific killing were still too fresh. Their doubts were many, voiced in half-whispers. Some suggested sending 5 or 10 hunters, while others insisted on no fewer than 15 if they wanted any chance against the unknown creature. Yet everyone understood that if too many left for the forest, the elderly and the women left behind would be defenseless. During the debate, Van kept glancing at Priest Talric, who stood to one side, head bowed as if immersed in thought. When one woman said it was foolish to risk everyone if the beast might come straight to the town gates, Talric quietly replied that it would be better to intercept it farther away. In the forest, he said, it would be easier to catch the beast unawares. Someone grumbled that without a strong defense, the town could become easy prey. But Priest Greywolf ignored the objections. He kept insisting the beast needed blood and would come for its next victim, so they must lay a trap before it snatched another life. Elder Rudrick, head lowered, pondered the risks. His eyes swept across the faces around him, harsh, frightened, but resolute. Breathing came hard. If the town was left with only a handful of defenders, who knew what would happen if the monster broke through to the houses? Sensing his turmoil, Talric presented a stark truth. Either they went hunting, or they would wait for another body in someone's yard. Even the mention of dead bodies chilled the gathering, reminding them of the child's bloody chest. In the end, Van agreed. They would send a sizable party. He proposed entrusting the task to Thorne Keller, the most experienced tracker. A sigh of relief passed through the group. Thorne was known for reading forest trails and spotting clues where others saw nothing. Yet the tracker himself remained silent, standing at the back as though considering how to track something of monstrous strength. Someone ventured that the creature might leave no tracks at all. Talric countered that the keen senses of the wolf-headed one would not fail them, hinting he could detect the presence of an unnatural force. At a wooden table lit by a flickering lantern, the elder went over the plan one last time. 15 people would head into the forest, supposedly to hunt the monster, while only a small group remained behind to guard the town. From the outside, it would look as though there was almost no defense. If the creature made its way in, hidden hunters would try to surround it. People listened, shifting on their feet, some uncertainly nodding in agreement that this might be their only chance. Van studied their faces, measuring doubt and determination. By the time the discussion ended, noon had passed. A gray gloom crept over the rooftops. The weather felt unnaturally cold, as though the very sky wished to remain a silent witness to the coming hunt. The elder announced that darkness would fall in a few hours and that preparations had to be complete by then. The townspeople scattered to carry out orders. Some were told to check the gate locks. Others were tasked with distributing spears. Near the barn came the clatter of metal. Everything that could be sharpened or honed was piled there. Those without firearms brought sickles or makeshift pikes. Meanwhile, Talric returned to Maria's home. He found her where he'd left her with the herbal brew. She was seated with her eyes closed, either dozing or lost to her grief. The priest sat beside her, touched her hand, and carefully checked her pulse. A flicker of compassion lit his gaze, but it quickly faded into steady calm. In a low voice, he told Perrin not to stray from the door, adding that the woman mustn't be left alone. On the other side of town, a party of 15 volunteers had gathered. Among them were a merchant, 2 experienced hunters, a pair of pale-faced young men, and Thorne Keller himself, quiet but capable. They checked their packs, which held strips of jerky rope and a bit of bread. Thorne remarked that they might have to spend at least 2 nights in the forest if the beast chose to slip farther away. He spoke sparsely, kept his axe by his side, and saw no need for long speeches. Many glanced at him with hope, as though he alone might grant them a chance against a vicious creature. Before they departed, Van said his farewells, clasping the hands of those who would take on the danger. He warned that if they found even the slightest trace of the monster's lair, they should send a messenger back at once. After all, those remaining, including Talric, were setting a trap and waiting for the beast to appear. Talric stood a short distance away, brow furrowed, as if listening to something beyond normal hearing. Now and then he lifted his head to glance at the nearest buildings, where fearful eyes peered from behind wooden walls. While the sun still peeked through the clouds, the 15 passed through the gates. The heavy doors closed behind them. At the elder's signal, a few young men set a firm crossbar in place. Only a handful of townspeople remained in the dim lanes. Nearly everyone else stayed indoors. Van personally went from house to house, urging people not to let their children outside. He repeated that the streets would stay dangerous until they knew for sure whether the beast would return. Someone muttered that all of this felt more like a nightmare tale than reality. Van only shook his head, as if agreeing that no one could have foreseen such a calamity. By sunset, the town walls seemed steeped in worry. Lanterns were lit in some places, though people feared the light might lure the predator. Others thought the darkness would be worse. At the elder's request, Priest Talric visited the main crossroads, where a watch post had been set. There stood one of the hunters, spear in hand. Talric advised him not to rattle his weapon at every sound. Animals, he warned, often heard more keenly than humans. The hunter swallowed his fear and promised not to spook at mere rustlings. Everyone, young and old, prepared for nightfall. Some filled large pots with water in case they needed to douse a fire. Several chests were carried into yards, ready to barricade doors if necessary. A heavy hush clung to the air. No one knew whether the dawn would come without more victims. At that moment, Maria roused in her darkened house and tried briefly to stand. Her legs nearly gave way from weakness, her mind dulled by Talric's brew. Outside, Perrin listened closely for any sound, knowing these doors might be where grief erupted again. Whether new misfortune would befall the town, no one could say. Yet all could sense the night would be long, and the forest, where the 15 had gone, would soon reveal whether the priest was right. Shadows deepened, and only faint torchlight glimmered through some windows. People tucked themselves into hidden corners, hoping the monster wouldn't appear, or if it did, that it would be spotted from afar. The air smelled of smoke and fear. Farther up the mountain road that wound from the high passes to remote settlements, the sky was overcast. The path climbed along jagged ledges overgrown with autumn brush. A mage named Corn Yoren and his companion, a former soldier named Luther Hoff, were riding on horseback. Corn, a gaunt man with a piercing gaze, held the reins carelessly, casting glances at the somber hills. Luther, broad-shouldered and red-haired, watched every side, wary of the slightest sound. They had traveled many miles already, and the fresh wind tugged at their cloaks. Following the slope, they suddenly noticed a figure lying motionless near a rocky outcrop. Luther narrowed his eyes, checking for others nearby. Corn frowned and said he would examine the area. He spoke a few quiet words, and an icy tremor rippled through the air. A wind elemental appeared at the crest of the rocks, a wavering cluster of translucent mist. Corn directed it upward to survey the region from above. Within a minute, the elemental returned, showing no sign of an ambush. Luther exhaled in slight relief, though his hand stayed near his sword's hilt. Corn signaled, and both cautiously approached the unmoving figure. From a distance, it looked as if the man was either unconscious or dead. On one side, a view of distant forest opened up. On the other, the ridge stretched out. Corn dismounted and drew closer. The man wore a short vest with patterns typical of mountain folk. A long-handled axe lay in the grass beside him. He was slim but wiry, with a thick beard and dark hair. Luther came up behind Corn, studying the hills suspiciously. Kneeling, the mage felt the injured man's head. The stranger was alive, but breathed unevenly. A bruise darkened his temple, and the skin near the crown was scraped away, exposing a bloody mess. He looked as though something heavy had struck him. Luther glanced sideways at Corn, but stayed silent, seeing him deep in thought. Corn set his hand over the wound, and a faint current of energy vibrated in the air. Though not a healer by calling, he knew spells to stanch blood and mend shallow wounds. Warmth slowly spread through the injured area, and the crust at the man's head stopped oozing fresh blood. The stranger came to for a moment, gasping, his mouth working for air. He rasped a few incoherent sounds, then managed Thorne Keller. His eyes flickered and he sank back into oblivion. Luther quietly cursed. The name meant nothing to him, but Corn raised his eyebrows as if realizing something important. He took out a flask and dabbed water on the man's lips. Looking over the vest's designs, Corn noted they resembled those worn by Highland dwellers. He recalled stories of odd sects, cults, and beliefs kept by mountain folk, but his priority now was to save the man's life. The mage spoke a brief incantation, and the wind elemental rose again above the outcrop, surveying the land around them. Luther said they should take a break here, as the wounded man was unlikely to keep walking. Corn nodded. He hadn't planned to linger, but there was no other option. While Luther searched for a level spot for the fire, Corn carefully inspected the tracker's axe. The handle was sturdy, adorned with intricate carvings. The blade remained sharp and free of any rust. It seemed its owner had taken great care of his weapon. The mage set the axe aside and shifted his gaze to the man's face, gaunt and pale. Did he even know where he was headed? Perhaps his group had been ambushed by bandits? Or had something even more dreadful occurred? The elemental scout had returned empty-handed. There was no sign of danger in the vicinity, save for distant mounds and crags. Luther arranged a small barrier of flat stones so the fire wouldn't be visible from the road. For his part, Corn spread out a tattered greatcoat and laid the wounded man upon it. Then he expended a bit more magic to treat the injury. The man grimaced and opened his eyes again. His gaze darted from Corn's face to the sky, as if trying to recall what had happened. "Who are you?" the mage asked quietly, careful not to speak too loudly. The wounded man slightly parted his lips, yet the words hesitated to form. He winced, as if a fresh surge of pain had ignited in his head. Luther sat down beside him and offered a mug of water. The stranger gulped several sips and exhaled in broken breaths. I'm Thorne," he managed to utter with difficulty before swaying to the side again, and Corn supported him. Several minutes passed before the tracker could speak more clearly. He stated his full name, Thorne Keller. When asked what had happened to him, he merely shrugged helplessly. "I don't remember," he muttered, blinking his red eyes. Corn inquired if any bandits or wild animals had been nearby. Thorne shook his head, as if unsure of the answer. Luther frowned upon noticing patches of dried blood on Thorne's clothing, aside from the wound on his head. He surmised that Keller might have encountered a relentless assault, but it was still unclear who had struck him. As twilight approached, Corn and Luther built a fire. The embers crackled, and a warm haze enveloped the grass, steeped in moisture. The sun sank behind the mountains, and the air filled with a damp coolness. Thorne drifted off to sleep only to awaken again, asking what time it was. His health remained fragile and his memory scarcely returned. After some time, Corn decided to take a risk. He warned Luther that he was about to cast a more complex spell, one that might help restore lost memories. Luther suggested not to do it here, but the mage insisted. It was better to understand the situation immediately, lest Thorne's companions be in search of him. After all, danger might be lurking nearby, one that should be known in advance. Corn placed his hand on the tracker's head and whispered the words of a mental weave. A warm burst pierced the air, and Thorne arched his back, his eyes rolling. Convulsions racked his body. He clutched the ground with his fingers, and a strangled groan burst from his chest. Luther almost lunged to pull Corn away, but the mage signaled him to wait. The spell was taking effect, though it remained unstable. Thorne's lips moved, uttering fragments of phrases. Monster. Crash. People fell. Talric. No, I can't. His voice faltered, descending into delirium. Then he fell silent, collapsing to the ground unconscious. Corn halted the spell, sensing that the tracker might not withstand further strain. Luther quietly cursed and shifted Thorne onto the greatcoat, covering him with his cloak to shield him from the cold wind. Thorne did not recover for a long while. The mage thoughtfully fiddled with the edge of his bag, pondering the words that had spilled from the sorrowful man. The name Talric could be the key to the mystery, but the very root monster made his heart clench. Perhaps this man had witnessed something truly horrific. Luther huddled closer to the fire, trying to warm his hands. He understood that the night's rest would be uneasy. Corn resolved to guard Thorne's sleep, for it was uncertain whether any creatures might be tracking them. The sighs of the night and the rustle of fallen stones from the mountain scree sounded especially loud as the three figures pressed against the fire, shrouded in darkness. Morning brought a heavy sky, cloaked in leaden clouds poised to burst into rain. At the foot of the hill where Corn and Luther had made camp, the air seemed saturated with dampness. The cooled embers of the fire smoldered. Thorne Keller, lying on the greatcoat, finally opened his eyes. He blinked and looked around as if bewildered by his surroundings. Luther stepped closer and helped him sit up. Thorne shook his head as he touched the bandaged wound. The pain distorted his features, yet he did not cry out, only clenching his teeth. Corn settled nearby and inquired about his condition. Thorne, trying to speak softly, explained that he felt an overwhelming weakness and vague images in his mind. Gradually, like ripples on water, memories surfaced. He recalled how he had left the town on the village elder's order, how he and his group had ventured deep into the forest. The hunters were in pursuit of a monster, and something monstrous had occurred. Thorne fell silent for a moment, his hands clenched, then hesitantly added, "They all perished. I only got concussed." Luther exchanged a glance with Corn. The mage placed a hand on Thorne's shoulder and asked what kind of beast had attacked them. The tracker grimly averted his eyes and murmured that the creature wielded some sort of sorcery and killed not like wild predators, but with cold calculation. He shook his head, as if in disbelief of his own words. The grassy slope around them seemed too peaceful for such tales. With a sigh, Corn suggested heading to the town where Thorne and his people lived. According to the tracker, the townsfolk faced danger if the monster was still alive. Luther grimaced, noting that they had different plans. They were supposed to be enlisting in a neighboring county's service. Yet he did not argue, seeing how Thorne clenched his fists. Keller requested help in returning. The town might be losing its last hope for salvation if all the other hunters were dead. As they prepared to depart, Thorne tried to stand on his own. His legs gave out, and Luther managed to catch him. They had to proceed slowly. Luther helped the tracker into Corn's saddle while he himself walked alongside, keeping hold of the horse. Corn walked slightly ahead, shaking his head. He was troubled by the thought that such a beast could have wiped out an entire group of armed men. He recalled scrolls about sorcerers capable of transforming into animals, but Thorne only spoke of frenzied attacks and torn-apart bodies. This indicated that Thorne himself did not know the exact nature of the monster. By midday, they descended from the hill to the forest's edge. They made their way through tall trees where the trail was barely visible. Luther scrutinized the branches keenly while Corn strained to sense any magical aura. Thorne occasionally groaned, yet he held himself together better than he had in the morning. He said he needed to show them the place where it all had happened. It seemed he was filled with a regret that verged on unspoken guilt. A couple of hours later, they reached a clearing where the grass was trampled and stained with brownish-red marks. The stench was suffocating, as if the blood of an entire herd had been spilled there. Corn tensed, sensing a strange energy that had settled in that place. Luther murmured softly that he had never witnessed such a slaughter. They dismounted and began to survey the scene. On the damp ground lay fragments of clothing, and nearby lay broken bows and spears. Further on, beneath crooked pines, bodies could be seen, about 12. Some had fallen on their sides, some lay face down, and others remained seated, leaning against tree trunks. Everywhere blood, faded and darkened. Thorne froze, his mouth agape, as if a lump was choking him from within. He recalled how he had departed into the forest with these people. Now all of them lay motionless, their faces frozen in expressions of terror. Corn stepped closer to one of the bodies. The cuts on the skin were even, as if made by a blade. In places, deep gashes were visible, as though some claws had indeed slashed the flesh. The mage ran his hand over one of the bodies and leaned in, trying to detect any lingering aura. But there was almost none, indicating that death had not occurred in the final hours. Luther approached another of the dead and examined him. He let out a quiet curse, for the man's head was nearly entirely severed. Luther's gaze hardened as he realized how brutally the battle had been fought. Thorne stood, leaning against a tree, staring at the faces of his fallen comrades. Their names echoed in his memory. He could not breathe evenly. His head was once again spinning. Fearing that the tracker might collapse, Corn came over and took him by the elbow, saying it was time to leave. This place exuded death, and the corpses had already begun to decay under the forest's dampness. Luther quietly asked whether it might not be better to bury the dead. Corn lowered his eyes and replied that they lacked the strength and time to consign so many bodies to the earth. Moreover, if any survivors remained in the town, they would need help. Thorne offered no objection. He seemed to understand that every delay could cost the lives of those still in the town. They hurriedly left the cursed clearing, making their way to the road that led through the forest to the town. Corn and Luther aided Thorne, who again felt weakness overtaking him. It seemed that this fresh layer of memories was assaulting his mind no less forcefully than a blow to the head. The tracker mumbled that he did not remember everything, but knew one thing. The creature might be far more dangerous than an ordinary beast. He repeated words about magic or a curse. The deepening twilight urged them to hurry. They reached a clearing marked by a split log and chopped branches, as if left behind after a hasty crossing through the thicket. Luther paused for a moment and picked something up from the ground. It turned out to be a fragment of clothing, soaked in congealed blood, and the piece of fabric seemed familiar, perhaps part of the uniform of one of the volunteers. A heavy silence hung in the air as they deliberated whether the monster might be lurking nearby. Thorne suggested they should not linger. Since this place exuded fear and death, it would be best for them to reach the town as quickly as possible. Thorne agreed, adding that perhaps some protection might be found near the gates. Luther lifted his gaze to the looming clouds and remarked that it would rain soon. All three hurried onto the trail, heading toward what Thorne believed was the route to human habitation. In farewell to that eerie place, only the lower branches of trees quivered in the wind. Here and there on the grass, drops of blood still glistened, appearing particularly sinister in the morning light. Yet not a single living soul stirred among the bodies. Thorne could feel the tension mounting. If the creature had possessed enough power to dispatch so many armed men, what fate awaited those still in the town? The evening sky was already growing dark as they neared the edge of the forest. Luther stayed close to Thorne, supporting him while Thorne walked slightly ahead, his hand occasionally drifting to the bag of scrolls. He was ready for any noise that might herald a new threat. None of them uttered a word, but each realized they had to warn the town in time. The journey to the town took a bit longer than Thorne had anticipated. His legs would not obey him, and the wound on his head reminded him with a dull ache. Thorne and Luther did not complain, but from Luther's look, it was clear he was prepared to stand up for both of them if danger appeared along the way. Thorne quietly scanned the surroundings, trying to detect the slightest magical vibrations. When they emerged onto a small rise from which the town was usually visible, Thorne stopped and frowned. Where there should have been roofs and gentle wisps of smoke, there was an eerie silence and virtually no movement. They moved closer. At the very gates, they found that the doors were ajar. It seemed odd. Under such circumstances, people would be expected to have secured themselves more tightly. Perhaps someone had fled in the panic. Luther tugged at the wooden frame, and the gates creaked open a little wider. Inside the town there was no sound of shuffling feet, no barking dogs, no human voices. Only a deathly silence that cut through the air. The travelers stepped through the gates, surveying the unusually empty streets. Everywhere, signs of human presence were evident. Near the smithy, scattered tools lay abandoned. By a column, a bucket of water stood, and at the barn, 2 horses were grazing. Yet there were no smiths or horse owners to be seen. Thorne stared tensely at the walls of the houses. Just yesterday, there had undoubtedly been life here. Now everything seemed to have perished. It was as if even the crows dared not alight on the roofs. Sensing the danger of an ambush, Thorne quietly uttered a spell, and several streaming entities, air elementals, appeared around him. They dashed through the alleys in barely perceptible currents, checking if anyone might be hiding around the corners. Luther kept his hand on the hilt of his sword, twisting his head tensely. Thorne quietly called out several names he recognized, hoping for even a response, but no one answered. The path led to the main square, where benches usually stood and life bustled. Now, however, the space was deserted. Thorne kept insisting that there had definitely been people here yesterday, many preparing for defense. Thorne, examining the cobblestones, noticed dark stains that appeared to be dried blood. Luther observed dragging marks, as if someone's body had been pulled toward a distant alley. The looks among the three turned anxious. Clearly, some sort of struggle had taken place. But where were the corpses? Soon they noticed a man in the attire of a priest lying face down at the threshold of a church. Thorne knelt and turned the body over. As he bent over, he flinched. It wasn't Talric, but another cleric, likely an assistant to the priest. His cassock was stained with blood, and a ragged wound gaped in his side. The man had already cooled, indicating he had not been killed just yesterday morning. Thorne surveyed the surroundings. The altar inside the church was empty, and the stained glass windows lay shattered. It appeared all the furniture had been overturned. Yet no one was there. They visited several more houses. On one doorstep lay crushed vegetables. On a windowsill, plates with half-eaten soup sat frozen. There were no signs of a struggle. Still, the bloodstains and disheveled traces told a different story. Luther, upon opening the barn door, saw 2 spooked horses left unguarded. They quietly neighed, as if pleading for water. The travelers watered them from a pail, glancing around warily. Thorne wished to find the village elder, Rudrick Van, or at least one of the hunters remaining in town. But the chapel, where they might have gathered, was deserted. The smell inside recalled coal and ash, yet there were no bodies. Only a few streaks of blood on the stone floor. They encountered no one in the corridors or distant rooms. The silence was oppressive, like a crushing gloom. It became clear. The entire population of the town had vanished, as if someone had taken them away in a single night. Thorne stood at the entrance of the house where Maria Borg, the mother of the slain boy, had once lived. The door was thrown open, yet inside he saw no one. On the table lay a broken mug and a dark stain spread across the floor. In the corner, beneath an overturned stool, lay scattered belongings. Thorne froze, as if straining to catch even the faintest sound. He heard nothing. Thorne and Luther deduced that these events could not have occurred without the involvement of a powerful enemy. Otherwise, people do not vanish overnight. The mage began to suspect that it was not a mere beast responsible, but something far more sentient. When Thorne mentioned Talric, the one who had proposed the plan to retreat into the forest, a dark suspicion stirred within Thorne. Luther recalled fragments of words that Thorne had shouted in delirium. Monster, priest, Talric. Everything pointed to the mystery being hidden somewhere within the town itself. When one of the elementals returned to Thorne, the mage felt a disquiet. The creature had found no clear signs of people, as if the town were already dead. Yet off to the side, behind an old smithy, they noticed several more blood-stained patches and dislodged planks. Thorne led Luther and Thorne over there. The scene was even more gruesome. Streaks of blood were splattered across the walls, as if someone had been wounded and dragged. Yet again, no corpse was found. Thorne nearly cried out upon grasping the horrifying reality of the town's disappearance. Luther closed his eyes for a moment, suppressing his anger. He had witnessed similar scenes after brutal raids, but then the bodies always remained, whereas here it was as if someone had methodically removed the people. The mage frowned and began to quietly repeat incantations, straining to sense any residual magic. The result was swift. The air near the nearest wall seemed imbued with something sticky, as if echoing remnants of sorcery. Thorne frowned, realizing that behind it all stood a sorcerer, or someone versed in dark rituals. Thorne stepped out onto the main street and called out loudly, naming several neighbors. The only answer was silence. Only from the direction of the barn came the intermittent neighing of a horse. The tracker ran toward the sound, but inside he found no one except a terrified creature. He couldn't comprehend how an entire town could vanish in such a short span. Images of his comrades' torn bodies, glimpsed in the forest, flashed through his mind. Had the townspeople met the same fate? Thorne and Luther joined him as they peered into hidden alleys where people might have taken shelter. Yet it was all in vain. It was as if some grim reaper had reaped all life in the town. Suddenly, Thorne recalled the priest Talric and murmured, "He said everything was under control." But now it was clear that there was no control at all, or rather control was being exercised by someone else. Before long, they approached a building that had served as a temporary armory. Inside, they found an overturned table marked with congealed blood and empty spaces where spears had once been stored. Several blades lay abandoned. Light filtered in through a broken window, illuminating the disorder. It was evident that people had attempted to arm themselves or fight back, but had failed to stop the oncoming force. Thorne lowered his head and whispered that they needed to search for even one survivor. If anyone had escaped, perhaps they could shed light on what had transpired. Luther nodded, while Thorne already knew that hope was slim under these circumstances. Everything pointed to a planned annihilation or abduction. They began scouring the surroundings and made their way to the elder's house. The door was sealed shut from the inside with a barrier, and no one answered when they knocked. Luther tried to break the lock, but inside the place was empty. The furniture had been shifted, as if someone had barricaded themselves in, but then abandoned their refuge. A stone wall in the corner bore fresh chips, as if struck by a heavy instrument. Upon closer inspection, Thorne noticed a tiny drop of blood on the edge of a hearth. After checking every corner, the three emerged onto the street, their minds numbed by the horror. Meanwhile, the sky had brightened, and a pale ray of sunlight broke through the clouds. But it brought no comfort. The town remained mute, as if it had exhaled its last breath along with its inhabitants. Thorne tightened the bandage around his head, gathering himself, and declared that they needed to press on to discover who was behind this and where the people had gone. Thorne frowned before stating that he didn't believe this was the work of a mere beast. There was too much blood, no bodies, and the lingering magical aura on the walls spoke of sorcery. Luther lifted his eyes to the sky, his fingers tightening on his sword's hilt. Suddenly Thorne froze and closed his eyes, as if a burning spark had flared up inside his head. His fingers clenched the axe's handle, and the muscles in his neck tensed. Thorne, Yoren, and Luther, combing through the empty houses and desperately searching for survivors, soon noticed that Thorne had stopped answering their questions. His breathing became erratic, and then, in short, broken bursts, he shouted, "Betrayal of the Elder. Blood everywhere." His voice was laced with malice and despair. It seemed as though Thorne's consciousness was oscillating between reality and dreadful memories from which he could not escape. Alarmed by his behavior, Luther cautiously moved toward the tracker. But Thorne suddenly swung his axe as if he saw an enemy before him. The blade skimmed just inches from Luther's chest, causing him to recoil. Thorne immediately understood that something dangerous was unfolding. He uttered a brief incantation to shield himself and his friend. A stream of air, twisted by an unseen force, whistled briefly around them. Thorne paid no heed to the magic. He acted as if possessed, screaming phrases of carnage and invoking some wolf god. His eyes were wide with terror, and beads of sweat formed on his face. Corn tried to speak in a low, soothing tone, attempting to bring Thorne back to his senses. But Thorne remained unresponsive, growing paler, swaying from side to side, and at one point raising his axe once more. This time, the mage managed to cast a weak binding spell. A thin veil of blue light enveloped Thorne's hands, dulling his movements. The tracker stood frozen, his mouth contorted as if struggling to break free from an enchantment. Yet the spell held his wrists tightly. Luther moved behind Thorne, ready to hold him if he tried to lunge. But at that moment, Keller moaned and, closing his eyes, collapsed to his knees. His lips murmured incoherently, "Wolfish visage. Talric. Blood on the altar." Seeing that Thorne was not himself, Corn intensified the spell. Wrapped in invisible bonds, the tracker was rendered immobile. Then the mage spoke calmly, urging Thorne to recount everything he had seen. Keller's gaze grew muddled, and his breathing faltered. In his semi-conscious state, he began to spout fragmented phrases. From them, Corn gathered that the priest Talric had once implanted a suggestion in Thorne, compelling the tracker to partake in the killings, though Thorne himself remembered no details. It also emerged that the elder Rudrick Van seemingly knew nothing of Talric's true plans. But then Thorne's voice broke off, and with a hoarse cry he collapsed to his side. Luther rushed to support Keller's head, striving to prevent him from striking the hard stone floor. Corn eased the spell slightly and leaned over to check his pulse. It was weak but steady. After a few labored breaths, Thorne managed to continue speaking, though his voice was broken. He said that during a foray into the forest, just before the attack on his unit, he had heard an order to strike at his own. He couldn't understand why he obeyed, but a voice inside his head demanded blood. Then he cried out that he had been commanded to act thus by the wolf-headed god, who had possessed him through Talric's spell. At that thought, he hissed and tried to break free. But Corn gently placed a hand on his shoulder, preventing him from descending into madness again. When Thorne finally regained his composure, the three resumed their journey through the alleys. Corn loosened his binding on the tracker slightly. His hands were no longer completely immobilized, though the mage kept the weave at the ready. As they passed another building, they saw bloody symbols on the walls. Lines of congealed blood formed patterns resembling wolf fangs, encircled by twisted signs. A heavy spirit of death seemed to dwell inside the house, as if a foul ritual had been performed there. Luther, examining the charred floor, discovered another mark scraped into the surface at eye level. With light barely seeping into the dim rooms, the images on the walls appeared especially ghastly. For a moment Corn stopped and wrapped his arms around himself. He noted that the odor was cloying and slightly sweet, like dried blood. In the murk, it seemed as though the walls were soaked in decay. Shakily, Thorne admitted that he couldn't recall all the details, but he was sure that Talric had conducted a sacrificial ritual in this town. The mage replied that this explained the disappearance of the people. They hadn't left of their own accord. They were offered as sacrifices to an unknown deity. Luther gripped his sword's hilt and peered into an adjoining room. There on the floor were more stains. Here and there lay torn scraps of clothing, and by the door a hinge had been ripped away. Confidently, Thorne declared that they couldn't remain here long. He proposed that they set out to seek help in the nearest large town. After all, the three of them couldn't stand against someone wielding such power. Luther agreed with a nod, adding that, in any case, they hadn't found any survivors. Thorne grimaced as he looked at the bloody traces. He felt a personal guilt, for it was possible that he, too, had committed murders while under Talric's influence. Thorne insisted they must leave, but Thorne suddenly reminded them, "We haven't checked that big house where the temple of the wolf-headed god stood. Perhaps there are still survivors there." Luther initially objected, but the mage agreed, suggesting that the temple might hold important clues. Passing through a narrow corridor between warehouses, the three came upon a street lamp toppled onto the ground. Its metallic support was twisted, with debris scattered all around. A few more steps brought them to a spacious structure whose facade bore carved images of wolf heads. In days gone by, this building served as a sanctuary, a place where townsfolk gathered to offer their tributes. Now, its front door stood ajar. Inside, near total darkness reigned, broken only by a soft rustling as if someone moved within the hall. Thorne raised a hand, urging caution. Luther stepped closer to the wall, sword at the ready, while Thorne gripped his axe more firmly, though his hands trembled. The mage murmured quietly that he sensed no significant magical disturbances, though that did not guarantee safety. The walls might be laced with runes that concealed further spells. They moved toward the entrance, listening intently for any sounds from within. The door creaked as Luther nudged it with his foot. Beyond the threshold, the floor was stained with brown blotches. For a brief moment, the soft rustling ceased, as if someone inside had paused to listen to the guests. Thorne closed his eyes and swept a hand through the air, as if trying to detect residual traces of magic. He felt a faint tingling in his chest, a sign that some force was indeed simmering behind these walls. Luther looked at Thorne, trying to gauge whether he was ready to enter. The tracker swallowed hard, but nodded. Though he felt a revulsion toward himself, he now yearned to understand whether any townsfolk still lived or if it was all over. Silently, they stepped over the threshold. The smell inside was heavier than out front. There were indeed traces of blood smeared across stone tiles. In a distant corner, a heap of rubble loomed, and shards of broken statues lay scattered. Through a gap in the roof, a faint daylight glow filtered in, making the hall resemble abandoned catacombs. Luther's eyes lifted to the ancient rafters, while Thorne listened intently to every sound. Thorne bowed his head, sensing that the familiar tremor was returning. Through the thick air came a faint shuffling sound from somewhere deep within the hall. Thorne raised a finger signaling silence and took a step forward. Suddenly, a figure flashed from behind a crumbling column, vanishing before they could discern any details. For a moment Thorne thought it might be a survivor, but his heart constricted with a foreboding dread. Luther shifted his sword aside, keeping it at the ready. Thorne turned to them, murmuring, "Stay alert." A crooked door led into a spacious hall that resembled a sanctuary. The ceiling hung high, though parts of the rafters were damaged and some boards had fallen away. Thorne, Thorne and Luther stepped over the threshold, each striving to make no sound. Underfoot, fragments of plaster and stone creaked with every step. A musty odor of stale, sour blood filled the space. In the deep recesses of the hall, the outline of an altar could be made out. There, a carved symbol of a wolf, its snarl exposed, ears perked, was visible. Luther lifted a torch, lit with a flint spark, and its trembling flame illuminated ragged bloodstains on the floor. It appeared that someone had been bleeding here or dragging wounded bodies, leaving dark streaks behind. Judging by the placement of stone hatches, the cellar lay beneath the altar. The air carried a dank moisture mixed with a stench reminiscent of decaying flesh. Thorne stepped forward, maintaining a small incantation to sense magical disturbances. A cold, icy sting shot through his hand as his eyes caught the cracks in the walls, scrawled with indecipherable marks. Thorne struggled to stifle a shiver, feeling that every memory triggered by these symbols brought on waves of nausea. He knew that he might have participated in brutal deeds while Talric had directed his will. As they neared the altar, dominated by the carved image of a wolf, a distinct footstep echoed from a side room. Luther instantly pressed himself against the wall. Thorne raised his hand, ready to unleash elemental forces, and Thorne gripped his axe. Out of the room emerged a man clad in black robes, stained with dried marks. It was Talric, the priest of the wolf-headed god. His face revealed no uncertainty or fear, only cold, unwavering confidence. He swept his gaze over the three and raised his hand. The floor trembled beneath their feet, as if struck by an earthquake. Thorne failed to counter the magical surge in time and was knocked off his feet. Luther managed to hold his ground but had to clutch a column for support. Thorne lunged at Talric, only to double over in acute pain at his temples, as if the priest had touched his very consciousness. The axe slipped from the tracker's grasp. He collapsed to his knees, crying out in agonizing delirium. Talric made no move to advance. He merely regarded them as unwelcome guests who could be turned away at any moment. Thorne tensed as he pushed himself up on his elbows, when he suddenly felt another wave of impact, as if a dark magic had burst upward from beneath the floor into the sanctuary. Ghostly shadows slithered along the walls, twitching in the light of Luther's barely held torch. The mage realized he was contending with a force nourished by recent sacrifices. He shouted a brief fire incantation, hoping to unbalance Talric. A fiery sphere burst from his palm and flew toward the priest. With a swift movement of his hand, Talric shattered the spell as if crumpling hot air and dispersing the flame before it could touch his garments. Seeing that Thorne's efforts were faltering, Luther dashed toward Talric, swinging his sword, but the floor beneath them wavered like unstable, shifting sand. His blade sliced through empty air, and Talric remained unmoved. In a quiet phrase, the priest unleashed a painful blow from an unseen source. Luther cried out and staggered backward. Amid the painful sizzling ringing in his ears, he caught a muffled laugh from the priest. Thorne tried once again to focus on the elemental forces. He managed to form an icy arrow that whistled as it sped toward Talric. This time, the strike was more precise. A cold shard meant to pierce the priest's chest, but Talric lifted his hand, and a spectral shadow erupted around him like the shape of a wolf. The arrow shattered into tiny ice fragments. A surge of panic gripped Thorne. Against him stood a power bolstered by bloody sacrifices. Talric showed no sign of weariness. He seemed imbued with dark might. On the altar's floor, shadows pooled and surged toward the prone Thorne. The tracker writhed, feeling something wrench at his consciousness. The priest extended a finger toward him, and Thorne seemed to lose his mind under a fresh wave of pain. He closed his eyes, a hoarse cry escaping his throat. Luther attempted to crawl closer, but Talric stepped toward him, and with a sharp motion of his hand sent the soldier flying back. A dull impact against a column made Luther cry out a curse. Summoning the last vestiges of his will, Khorne forged a fiery orb, channeling every bit of magical energy he had left. A brilliant ball hurtled toward Talric, casting an unsettling glow over the sanctuary. The priest raised his hand, and a brief grimace of effort flickered across his face. It seemed as if he intended to absorb the spell as well, but the force of the flame was formidable. For a moment, the fire gnawed through the barrier of shadows, drawing a quiet snarl from the priest. Yet Talric, averting his eyes, suddenly invoked the influence of his dark god. On the floor, multitudes of shadows condensed, becoming denser than ordinary mist. They surged in opposition to the fiery orb. Then came an explosion. Whether from clashing spells or the resonance of an alien power, no one could say. Khorne screamed aloud as one of the shadows pierced his side. He exhaled convulsively, feeling a searing pain rising to his heart. Luther, pressed against a stone, saw this and desperately rushed toward the mage. But he was halted by a faceless clump of darkness that coiled around his arm and lashed his stomach. The soldier gasped and collapsed to the floor, convulsed in agony. Life seemed to drain swiftly from both of them, as if Talric's tendrils had sunk into their hearts. In an instant, silence returned. Khorne, trying to lift his eyes, could not muster even a sigh. He fell, staring at Talric, whose pupils glowed with an eerie light. The mage's throat no longer produced a sound, and blood trickled down the stone. Luther jerked nearby, but his consciousness faded under the onslaught of black magic. Their bodies lay on the cold floor, unresisting and empty. Talric slowly straightened himself, as though he had just dismissed a trivial interference. The dying flicker of a torch illuminated Thorne's contorted figure. He had not suffered a mortal blow, yet his mind was already overwhelmed by enchantments. The priest drew nearer, silently bending and placing his palm on the tracker's nape. Thorne felt an alien will descend upon his consciousness. He wanted to resist, but he lacked the strength. Without a word, Talric straightened again and led Thorne away like a subservient prisoner. The sanctuary was smothered in an ominous silence, and the life within Khorne's and Luther's bodies had faded. The town had finally fallen under Talric's dominion, a power that enabled him to move on, bolstered by the strength of his bloody ritual. In the basement of the former sanctuary, a suffocating dampness reigned. Talric led Thorne forward, whose steps were unsteady. The stairs creaked underfoot, and the weak glow of the torch revealed from the darkness mounds of bodies piled against the far wall. There lay men, women, and even teenagers, those who had failed to escape on that fateful night. Their faces were frozen in terror, and some of the bodies were bound with coarse rope. The corpses appeared recent, for the toxin of decay had not yet spread deep into the catacombs. Yet the stench in the basement was so foul that Thorne gasped for breath in ragged draws. Talric stopped beneath a stone vault, upon which strange symbols were incised. He carefully set the torch on a ledge so that its gleam would illuminate the center of the basement. Thorne, lowering his head, tried not to look at the heaps of bodies. The memory of how, under the sway of enchantment, he had aided the priest seared his mind with painful shame. Talric glanced back at him, and a cold glint flashed in his eyes. In the midst of the stone floor lay magical signs, drawn in the blood of the victims. It seemed the ritual was nearing its conclusion. Talric raised his hand, and once more Thorne felt a nauseating pressure upon his mind. A fit of frenzied trembling returned, yet he did not resist. Within him, the remnants of his will had withered after Corn's and Luther's deaths. The priest traced his fingers along the lines on the floor, etching new patterns with the blood of the recently slain. A pulse of magic rippled through the basement. The stone walls shuddered. Dust began to fall from the vault. Thorne lost all sense of up and down. A constant hum filled his ears, as though a roaring wind had invaded the sealed chamber. In a hoarse tone, Talric intoned incantations, addressing the wolf-headed god. Amid these utterances one could discern mentions of accepting the gifts and devouring lives. Along the walls, shimmering shadows danced as if someone had traced a circle with a torch. The piles of townsfolk's bodies creaked, as if moved from within. Thorne shuddered, though his mind remained bound by enchantment. He saw Talric step toward the first body in a heap and place his hand upon the forehead of a slain woman. She no longer breathed, yet her skin convulsed, as if an unearthly force had surged through her muscles. A magical impulse burst through the basement, seeping into the walls. This was the final stage of the blood-soaked rite. Talric cast a quick glance at Thorne, as though checking to see if he might rise in resistance. But the tracker remained in a state of stupor, sensing only echoes of terror. In Thorne's eyes flickered a void like that of a broken man. The priest nodded to himself in satisfaction. He resumed his whispered prayers to the wolf-headed god, invoking the power of the deity to whom these sacrifices had been dedicated. After several minutes, a brilliant beam of sorcerous energy struck the center of the circle. Stone slabs sank, wood decayed, and the lime mortar crumbled, transforming the vault into a cascading pile of sand. Outside, beyond the basement, a muffled crack resounded. Wooden houses were collapsing as if subjected to decades of decay in mere moments. The streets began to crumble in clumps of earth and gravel. The town was falling apart. Thorne realized that Talric had initiated the self-destruction of the settlement. No one would ever know what exactly had transpired, for not even walls would remain. Amid the pounding of his troubled heart, Thorne heard a dull thud as the sanctuary's roof collapsed above. The entire structure shuddered, and dust billowed downward. Stones fell, yet the space around Talric remained untouched, as if an invisible barrier shielded him and the basement. The priest continued to murmur his mantras. From the pile of bodies emerged the last clots of bloody energy, seeping into the symbols on the floor. The carved image of a wolf on the stone seemed alive, its jaw slightly agape, its fangs sharpened. Even in the dim light of the torch, there was an uncanny sense that the wolf was gazing at them with derision. Thorne squeezed his eyes shut as a soft scraping sound reached his ears. Right in the center of the room, the specter of a malicious creature appeared, a hybrid of man and beast. The features of its snout were vaguely discernible, yet its heavy fangs were unmistakable. This was the essence of the wolf-headed god, having taken on a projection in our world. It wrapped a phantom claw around Talric, forcing a hoarse sound from him. The priest's body arched, his muscles tensed to the limit, and the outlines of swollen veins became visible through his clothing. Talric screamed, whether in pain or ecstasy, while the spectral wolf bared its fangs, penetrating into his very being. Above, the town was collapsing utterly. Small structures tumbled as if destroyed by a storm. The streets were overtaken by pulsating vegetation, sprouting directly from the earth. It seemed as if time itself had reversed or descended into chaos. Thorne, stunned by the spectacle, could not tear his eyes away from the priest. Now he rasped. His contorted fingers seemed to rip through the air. In one moment the wolfish spectre vanished, and in its place where Talric had stood arose a new form, cloaked in black fur with prominent fangs. The priest's face elongated, morphing into a lupine maw. He tore at his own flesh, and from the gashes emerged the muscles of a beast. His wide eyes remained human, yet his pupils dilated and shifted to an amber hue. His hands lengthened, claws sprouted. A wave of unnatural power pierced the basement. Thorne, pinned against the wall, felt fear shatter his will, for there existed something far more terrifying than a mere priest, a werewolf, fusing monstrous strength and sorcery. Standing on semi-bent limbs, Talric lifted his muzzle toward the ceiling and gave a forceful shrug. A roar resounded in the air, ringing in their ears. The fur along the nape of this hybrid stood on end. The beastly creature took several heavy breaths, listening to the cadence of its new body. Thorne, lost and paralyzed by the bewitching command, could only watch as Talric, no longer wholly human, emitted a wolfish snarl. Now, as the town above crumbled, the new master of dark rituals had gathered strength and emerged beyond the confines of the basement. The earth shuddered, and dust cascaded like a river from the cracked vaults. The creature spun around, seized a bundle of pilfered items. Within it were pouches of precious trinkets and various magical objects. It glanced at Thorne, seemingly deciding to spare the tracker's life. Thorne himself could not fathom why he should live when all was already lost. Yet Talric merely growled and moved toward the staircase. Ascending, he strode steadily, though the basement might soon vanish. Thorne followed him as if he had no other choice. When they emerged onto the surface, the town was disappearing in swirling clouds of dust. Houses had collapsed, and in place of some buildings, thick overgrowth, cloaked in suffocating gloom, had taken root. In some spots, roots crept out of the ground as if feeding on the remnants of walls. The streets were covered by a layer of fallen beams and sunken bricks. Abandoned or discarded objects, barrels, chests, protruded from beneath the rubble. Thorne gazed at it all with trembling awe, realizing that only he remained alive, and the new incarnation of Talric. The beast surveyed the dark ruins before stomping away, dragging the mute, terror-stricken tracker with it. A few days later, a caravan of merchants trundled onto the abandoned plain where a mountain town once stood, bound for nearby settlements along that road. They were astonished to discover that where once wooden roofs and thin streams of chimney smoke were visible, now lay a strange field, entirely overgrown with grasses and shrubs that far exceeded the usual wild growth. One of the drivers recalled that he had traversed this route before and seen entire streets, but now recognized nothing. Everything looked as if years had passed and the town had decayed. There was not even a hint of old walls. The merchants made camp on that overgrown square and rummaged through the vegetation, seeking any trace of people. They found nothing but fragments of stone and a few pieces of rotting wood. One of the drivers, named Hart, noted that beneath their feet there were strange cracks, as though the soil had collapsed inward. The air was damp and carried a raw smell that evoked thoughts of underground voids. An unsettling chill pierced the soul. No one could explain where all the inhabitants had gone. Several members of the caravan's guard dispersed along the perimeter, hoping to find even a single surviving structure. In time, they returned empty-handed. The authorities of the nearest town, upon hearing the news, sent a border patrol. The soldiers arrived a week later, only to find the same scene: rampant vegetation, sunken stones, and complete silence. There were no human traces, as though people had vanished along with their houses. The soldiers excavated a small area, but only encountered brittle stone that crumbled at the slightest tap of a shovel. It seemed as if Oblivion had long reigned there. Official reports recorded a possible epidemic or an attack by a wild beast, but no one could offer a precise explanation. Local residents, upon hearing the news, spoke of strange lights at night and eerie howls among the trees. Rumors began to swell, accumulating into ghastly tales. People started referring to this area as the Cursed Field, a place best avoided. As weeks turned into months, the stories of the town that had vanished in an instant became campfire legends. Border guards ceased sending soldiers on futile searches. Caravans were forced to bypass these lands altogether so as not to disturb the unclean force rumored about in roadside inns. Some claimed the place was enchanted and that anyone who set foot there would never return. Thorne survived, yet his words were met with disbelief. One day he appeared on the northern road, emaciated, muttering something about the accursed priest. Strangers picked him up and took him to a small town on the opposite bank of the river. However, no one was convinced by his account of the bloody ritual and the werewolf. They believed he was merely confused or mad. Soon Thorne vanished. Rumor had it he was seen at a roadside tavern, and then his trail was completely lost in the hills. A dusty road led to a large city, where stone walls towered over the plain and lanterns burned on guard towers in the evenings. Talric, once again assuming human form, walked along the roadside, leading a small horse laden with bundles. The journey took several days, during which towers and bright roofs gradually emerged on the horizon. In his pack lay magical accoutrements and jewels obtained after the ritual. Thorne no longer accompanied him. Perhaps the werewolf deemed the worn-out tracker unnecessary. At the city gate, Talric presented a few valuable coins to the stationed guard, who, without much inquiry, allowed the stranger to pass. The city greeted him with the clamor of shops, the clatter of wagon wheels, and the hum of a crowd. No one here knew of the catastrophe that had befallen the distant mountain town. Talric strolled slowly along the streets, glancing briefly at the signs of taverns and workshops. He chose a modest inn on the outskirts, where he could rent a room without drawing too much attention. Settling in, the priest unrolled several scrolls on a table. One described portals leading to various corners of these lands. Another mentioned special rituals that would strengthen the priest's connection to his deity. Talric understood that even in this city there were plenty of simpletons who could not stand against dark magic. He leaned back back on a hard stool, removed his boots, and chuckled quietly as he sensed his bestial nature peeking through his human guise. That night in his room, he performed a ritual to seal away magical doors. He strove to block any attempts by learned mages to track him through astral paths. The incantations passed without fanfare, but the air filled with a heavy odor of grease and smoldering herbs. In a corner of the room, Talric erected a tiny altar to the wolf-headed god, a small stone marked with symbols, upon which fresh blood dripped from a piece of meat purchased at the market square. This modest rite was the beginning of a new phase. A thirst for blood and power increasingly drove him to seek new victims. The next day he looked out over the city from the top floor of the inn. The stone roofs receded toward the horizon, and beyond lay new lands. People walked the streets, unsuspecting of the one who had taken up residence among them. Talric knew that his bestial fangs could emerge at any moment if he shifted into his werewolf form. Sometimes he would let out a quiet growl in the half-light of his room, testing whether his transformation had grown sufficiently stable. Evening fell. Down below, the inn filled with the raucous voices of the drunk. Talric sat in the shadow by the window, studying scraps of paper that described inadequately defended cities. He leafed through records preserved from earlier quests, pondering his next destination. He needed souls and blood to nourish his bond with the wolf-headed god. And all around him lived masses of unsuspecting people. The priest smirked, imagining how easily he could silently intimidate or inebriate the affluent townsfolk. Under cover of night, Talric left the inn, quietly opening a window. On a deserted side street he turned and beheld his own reflection as a werewolf. Soon the darkness parted before a towering lupine figure with draping paws and razor-sharp fangs. The sky glimmered with the dull light of the moon, and the alley reeked of stagnant sewage. The priest-werewolf stepped onto the cobblestone pavement and bolted forward. Now he felt the night air with every heightened sense. His fur bristled, and his claws scraped the stone. A predatory pleasure surged in his chest, a sensation to which he offered no resistance. The city slept, unaware that within its dark alleys lurked a monster capable of tearing a random passer-by apart in an instant. Talric, gliding like a shadow along the walls, scanned the windows. He longed to savor the taste of fear, to sink his fangs into the flesh of those who slept soundly. But for now he held back, preferring to wait for the right moment. A ravenous growl burst from his throat as he leapt onto a barrel, realizing that within reach lay entire blocks unprotected by any battle mages. Thus began a new hunt. The priest, long having shed his human limitations, amassed ever greater power. The people around him had no inkling of the danger that had infiltrated their midst. The werewolf melted back into the night, restraining his burning desire for blood, though he knew that soon surrender to that craving would become his new habit. No guard awaited the monster. No one knew of the lupine incarnation that had flickered into view in the dim moonlight around the corner.